Greetings. In this episode, I will tell you about the Great Plague of London in 1665 to 1666 in England, as well as in other European countries. After the end of the Great Plague of the 14th century, local outbreaks of the disease occasionally occurred in various parts of the island. In the 17th century alone, the disease struck London 3 times. In 1603, when 30,000 Londoners died from the plague, in 1625, with 35,000 deaths, and in 1636, when the plague claimed 10,000 lives. The epidemic of 1665 to 1666 was the largest, with over 100,000 people dying from the disease. However, it was also the last epidemic of bubonic plague in England, which is perhaps why it is so deeply ingrained in the memory of the English people. In the mid-17th century, London was a settlement covering an area of 448 hectares, surrounded by a city wall and suburbs. In the middle of the century, it had a population of 450,000 to 500,000 people. The sanitary conditions were dire. The city lacked a sewage system, and, like in the Middle Ages, waste flowed directly down the center of the winding streets. The cobblestones were slick with garbage, manure, and refuse thrown out of houses, and in the summer swarms of flies filled the streets. The city was shrouded in smog from the smoke of metallurgical factories, soap factories, breweries, and the 15,000 coal-heated homes. An awful stench lingered everywhere, and people walked around with handkerchiefs covering their noses. Outside the city walls in the suburbs, merchants and artisans, numbering more than 250,000, lived in similarly unsanitary conditions in wooden houses. Naturally, a significant number of them visited the already overcrowded city daily. It is believed that the epidemic reached England from the Netherlands, where outbreaks of bubonic plague occurred periodically. The disease was likely brought to the British Isles by Dutch merchant ships transporting cotton. Unlike the Black Death, this time the plague spread very slowly, almost imperceptibly. In early September 1664, rumors reached London about a new outbreak of plague in the Netherlands, which had seemingly ended in 1663. In November, the first 2 plague victims were reported in London. They were 2 Frenchmen renting an apartment on Drury Lane. However, the alarmed Londoners soon calmed down, as no new cases were recorded for a long time. In mid-February, another person died in the same parish. By April, 3 deaths from the plague had been recorded. However, during this period, the overall number of deaths from various diseases increased significantly, and the authorities began to raise the alarm, justifiably fearing that the relatives of the deceased and the parish administrations were intentionally hiding cases of the plague and falsely attributing the cause of death to other, more neutral causes. This was facilitated by the procedure for recording deaths. When someone died, a bell would toll, and a searcher of the dead would come to inspect the corpse and determine the cause of death. Most of the searchers were ignorant old women who, for a bribe, could enter a distorted cause of death in the official records. When a person died of the plague, a bribed searcher would list another cause of death, because the buildings where plague victims lived were supposed to be closed for a 40-day quarantine, with all family members locked inside. The doors of such houses were marked with a red cross and the words, "Lord, have mercy upon us," and a guard was stationed at the door. The King's Privy Council ordered the justices of the peace to investigate every suspicious case and, in cases of fraud, to enforce the necessary quarantine measures. The justices of the peace were instructed to investigate any suspected cases and to close the house if the deception was confirmed. This even led to a riot in the St. Giles area after the authorities sealed the first house. Incidentally, this slum area became one of the centers of plague spread. As warmer weather arrived, the disease began to spread more rapidly. The Great Plague of London was vividly described by Daniel Defoe in his novel A Journal of the Plague Year. Although this work was published in 1722, 57 years after the events it describes, Defoe meticulously studied almost all available sources and the memoirs of contemporaries. Additionally, he made use of his uncle's diaries. Therefore, I will primarily recount the course of the epidemic based on Defoe's novel. In May 1665, the weather was cool, and the number of victims was minimal. Across all 97 parishes, only 54 people died of the plague, most of whom lived closer to the outskirts. In June, the number of deaths increased, but so far, all the deaths were recorded in the suburbs. By July 1665, the plague had reached the heart of London. King Charles II of England, along with his family and court, left London and moved to Oxford. However, most city officials chose to stay. Sir John Lawrence, the Lord Mayor of London, also decided to remain in the city, putting himself under quarantine with the help of a specially constructed glass enclosure. This allowed him to perform his duties without coming into contact with potentially infected individuals. In June and July, people began fleeing the city. The roads became crowded with carriages, wagons, and carts loaded with belongings. Defoe wrote, "Nothing was to be seen but carts and wagons with goods, women, servants, children, coaches filled with people of the better sort, and horsemen accompanying them, all hastening away." The flight was exacerbated by rumors that the city would soon be sealed off and that the government would set up cordons on the roads to prevent the movement of people across the country. The poor were also alarmed by the spreading infection, and some left the city. However, in other places, they had nowhere to stay and no means of subsistence, so fearing an uncertain future, many chose to remain in the city. As people left the city gates, everyone had to present a certificate of good health issued by the Lord Mayor, which was becoming increasingly difficult to obtain. As time passed, the number of victims grew, and unrest began among the inhabitants of nearby villages, as there were no longer places to accommodate the refugees. The refugees returned, were not allowed into towns, and many had to travel through rough terrain, surviving on what they could gather from the fields or steal. Many died along the way from thirst or hunger. By August, the exodus from the city had reached such proportions that it seemed only the magistrate and servants remained in the city. The appearance of the city had changed dramatically. The streets were deserted, and fear and anxiety were etched on the faces of the people. In September, the epidemic reached its peak. Those terrible 9 weeks of the Great London Plague began, during which, even by conservative estimates, about 1,000 people died daily. Most Londoners perished during September and October. Defoe wrote, "Crying and lamentations were heard almost in every house, especially at the beginning of the plague. Later, people's hearts hardened, as death was constantly before their eyes, and they ceased to mourn the loss of loved ones and friends, daily expecting that they themselves would meet the same fate." Some priests initially visited the sick, but this did not last long, for it was like facing death itself. Even gravediggers, the most hardened people in the city, sometimes backed away, not daring to cross the threshold of homes where entire families had been wiped out by the disease and where the circumstances of death were particularly horrific. Many people died suddenly right on the streets without any symptoms warning them of the illness. Others managed to reach the nearest stall or shop, or simply a doorstep, sat down, and died. Corpses lying in the streets were a natural and familiar sight during this period of the London plague. If at the beginning of the epidemic, people would stop at the sight of a dead body, later on, no one paid attention anymore. They simply crossed to the other side of the road. Entire families perished, and sometimes even entire streets. There was no famine, as the London authorities paid suppliers a commission of 1 farthing above the usual price for every quarter of grain unloaded at the London port. Several attempts were made to establish a public health system to effectively combat the epidemic. The city authorities hired doctors and organized the careful burial of victims. Specially hired men rode through the city on carts, calling out, "Bring out your dead," and carried away heaps of bodies. Soon, the carts were no longer sufficient, and corpses began to be piled along the houses. The cause of the disease was unknown, but many believed it was spread by animals, so the London Corporation ordered the killing of cats and dogs. It is quite possible that this decision worsened the epidemic as the animals controlled the rat population, which carried fleas. To purify the air, the authorities ordered the lighting of giant bonfires in the streets, and the fire in household hearths was to be kept burning day and night in the hope that the air would be cleansed. The treatment, as before, was completely ineffective. The most radical remedy was considered to be the excision of buboes, which in most cases led to the worsening of the patient's condition, although in some instances, when pus drained from the wound, the patient would recover. Among other remedies, Venetian syrup was particularly popular, a medicine consisting of 60 or 70 components mixed with honey. Frog liver, goose droppings, crab claws, elk hooves, and many other substances were considered to be medicinal. People with means took very serious measures. They ventilated rooms, burned incense, bay leaves, rosin, and sulfur, and then used a small gunpowder explosion to force the infected air to burst outside. Others would light a strong fire in their fireplaces and keep it burning for several days. There were also mishaps in this disinfection process. On Thames Street, to drive out the plague seeds from a house, one servant brought in so much gunpowder that the explosion blew off part of the roof. City dwellers constantly carried bottles or handkerchiefs with aromatic substances in their pockets to breathe through them in the presence of plague victims, or if they had to approach a corpse. In transactions, money was dipped in vinegar, and buyers always carried plenty of small change to pay exactly. Even now, in town and village markets in England, you can still see stone market crosses with a hollow at the base. During the epidemic, vinegar was poured into these hollows to dip coins into. Doctors would visit the sick with protective aromatic pastilles in their mouths. There was no shortage of charlatans of all kinds trying to profit from people's suffering. Defoe wrote, "Many townsfolk, driven by fear, resorted to any madness and ran to sorcerers, witches, and other fraudsters to learn their fate, who in turn fueled their fears and kept them in a state of constant anxiety and anticipation to further deceive them and line their own pockets. They, as if possessed, chased after every healer and charlatan, every practicing old woman in search of remedies and potions. They stuffed themselves with so many pills, mixtures, and so-called preventative measures that not only did they throw money to the wind, but in their fear of infection, they prematurely poisoned themselves, weakening their bodies instead of strengthening them." At the same time, it is impossible to even imagine how many advertisements from all sorts of quacks, pretending to be healers and offering people their remedies, were plastered on house doors and at street corners. They were composed in such florid terms as flawless preventative pills against the plague, the most effective protection against infection, the best fortifying remedy against unhealthy air, exact instructions on taking measures to avoid infection, plague preventative pills, an incomparable mixture against the plague, never before used, a universal cure for the plague, the only effective medicinal water against the plague, the royal antidote for all diseases, and many, many others which I do not recall, and even if I did, they alone would fill an entire book. Others placed advertisements offering visits and advice for preventing illness. These advertisements were often quite detailed. For example, a famous Dutch physician recently arrived from Holland, where he lived in Amsterdam during last year's plague outbreak, and cured many people who had already contracted the plague. Or a matron from Italy, newly arrived from Naples, possesses a secret for preventing infection, discovered through her vast experience in treating the plague. She performed miracles during the last plague in Italy, when 20,000 people were dying each day. Or an old woman who successfully practiced during the last London plague in 1636 gives advice only to women. Or an experienced physician who has long studied antidotes against all poisons and infections, after 40 years of practice has reached such mastery that, with God's help, he can instruct people on how to avoid any contagious disease. The poor receive advice for free. I provide these advertisements as examples. I could have included 2 or 3 dozen more, and still many would have been left unmentioned. But even these are sufficient to give an idea of the mindset of that time, how thieves and swindlers not only robbed the poor through deception, extracting money from them, but also poisoned them with foul and horrifying concoctions, some of which contain mercury, and others even worse substances, having nothing to do with medicine and, in case of illness, doing more harm than good to the body. Undoubtedly, all these quacks profited immensely from the suffering of others. We saw daily how crowds of people chased after them, and more people gathered at the entrances of their homes than at the doors of Dr. Brooks, Dr. Upton, Dr. Hodges, Dr. Berwick, or any other of the renowned physicians of that time. I was told that some of them made as much as £5 a day from their remedies. But there was another epidemic, worse than the first, that illustrates the confusion of the poor during those times. This involves spells, magical formulas, charms, love potions, talismans, amulets, and other concoctions meant to protect the body against the plague, as if the plague were not sent by the Lord, but was subject to an evil spirit, and could be prevented with crosses, zodiac signs, papers tied with a specific number of knots, marked with a particular sign or word, such as the word abracadabra, arranged in a triangle or pyramid. Various soothsayers and false prophets emerged. One, like Jonah in Nineveh, shouted in the streets, 40 more days, and London shall be destroyed. Another, dressed only in trousers, ran through the streets, constantly crying out, O great and dreadful God! And nothing more. He only repeated these words with terror, never slowing his pace, and no one, as far as I know, could persuade him to stop, rest, or eat. I encountered the poor man several times in the streets and tried to speak with him, but he never engaged in conversation with me or anyone else, only repeating his ominous exclamations. You can see a depiction of this false prophet in the illustration. But now it's time for us to return to the account of the plague's progress. In November and December, the number of new cases gradually decreased, and the nature of the disease itself began to change. Fewer people were dying, and most of those who fell ill were recovering. Now, the majority of those who contracted the plague were surviving. Many people recovering from the plague appeared on the streets. They had a very distinctive appearance, and Londoners could easily recognize them, whether it was a bandaged neck or a limp caused by buboes in the groin. However, no one was afraid of or avoided them anymore. Entire infected families who had fallen ill and had even called priests to pray for them in anticipation of death were now recovering, something that would have been impossible just a month earlier. In December, the number of cases was still significant, but by January 1666, the epidemic had essentially come to an end. By February 1st, the king returned to his London residence at Whitehall. Isolated outbreaks of the disease continued until September 1666, but at a much slower pace. From September 2nd to 5th, the Great Fire of London raged through the city, destroying homes in most densely populated areas. Around the same time, the plague outbreak ceased, likely because most of the infected fleas perished in the fire, along with the rats that carried them. Thus, the story of the Great Plague of London of 1665 to 1666 comes to an end. Goodbye.